Yes, thank you everyone for joining us. So my name is Emma. I'm from the Yinova Center, and I wanted to thank you for joining us this evening. Before we dive into our discussion on immunoflexibility, for those of you who are new to our community, I wanted to let you know about our center, as well as tell you a bit more about our speakers. So Yinova is a leading Chinese medicine practice acclaimed for its expertise in reproductive health and fertility. Working in partnership with patients, we are dedicated to providing integrative care with meaningful results. As of recently, we've moved part of our practice online, and we've been offering virtual consultations to support our patients, and we've reopened our clinical doors and are available for in-clinic acupuncture as well. After graduating at the top of his class from Pacific College of Oriental Medicine, and now with 15 years of clinical experience behind him, Dr. Jeremy V Pulcifer is a gifted healer who we are lucky to have on the Yinova team. He has been a professor at Pacific College of Oriental Medicine in New York City for over a decade, where he teaches research in statistics, esoteric acupuncture, extraordinary vessel theory, and biophysics. It is his work as a professor in the biological aspects of physics and the neurophysiology of acupuncture that allowed Jeremy to engage in part with Dr. Joel Blakeway's acclaimed book, Energy Medicine. A good portion of Dr. Pulsifer's work centers around fertility medicine, though he also has a focus on mood disorders, pain management, orthopedics, and sports medicine. And then we have Dr. Joel Blakeway, who is a renowned acupuncturist and herbalist, celebrated author, and the founder of Yinova, where she has been treating patients for over 2 decades. Jill has always been passionate about supporting people's health, in particular their reproductive health, and credits much of her success to combining the ancient wisdom of Chinese medicine with modern conventional biomedicine. To that end, Jill wrote her third book, Energy Medicine, The Science and Mystery of Healing, to describe what it means, both personally and scientifically, to be an energy healer. Her book draws on cutting-edge research to explain how acupuncture and energy medicine work, and her research on energy medicine has been published in the Journal of Alternative and Complementary Medicine. Thank you to everyone who submitted questions prior to this discussion. Jill and Jeremy will try to cover everything, though we'll also have time at the end for questions as well. And with that, I'm going to pass this over to Dr. Pulsifer and Dr. Blakeway to get started.
Well, thank you, Emma. That was a lovely introduction. So hi, everybody watching at home. And Emma's turned her video off for now. I wanted to talk about this subject because for a long time, I have been concerned that we treat immunity a little lightly. And probably like you during these times, I see lots of articles on the internet of, 15 ways to boost your immunity. And I think immunity is very complex, and it is part in Chinese medicine of our qi. And I always explain qi this way to my patients. Qi is your body's intelligence. It's every bit of you that isn't skin and tissue and organ and bone, which is quite a lot of you. You would be a completely inert body if your body didn't have a system of communication that was very intelligent. And all of those decisions get taken outside of your mind for some fairly obvious reasons. Because if you had to remember to speed up your breathing or to deal with your metabolism, you wouldn't last very long. So your body has a consciousness all of its own. And in Chinese medicine, we say it's modulating yin and yang. It's both receptive, yin, and active, yang. And it toggles between yin and yang, receptivity and activity, the entire time to keep us in homeostasis. And never is that more true than in the immune system, which is one of the most intelligent systems in the body. It has a hugely important role, as we know, and it can underperform. And we become susceptible to disease, but it can also overperform. And we see a lot of autoimmune issues, a growing number of autoimmune issues. And it may be the reason why Chinese medicine is so good at treating autoimmune issues, because we are in the business of prompting the body's intelligence to self-regulate. And as we've gone through this pandemic, we've obviously looked after a lot of patients with COVID, not on our own, in conjunction with Western medicine. And one of the things that I have been really impressed by was how Chinese medicine helps people navigate disease. And a lot of people who died of COVID, sadly, didn't die because their immune system was underactive. They died because this was a novel virus, a virus their body hadn't seen seen before, and their body mounted the kind of defense that was overwhelming, and they began to attack themselves. It's called a cytokine storm. And so I thought it was about time that we had a discussion on how to promote immunoflexibility, which I think is what we really want to do. And that's actually a subject that's particularly dear to my heart because, as Emma mentioned, reproductive medicine is one of our specialties at Yinova. And I have noticed that my fertility patients in their late 30s, early 40s, when they have trouble getting pregnant, they're often told, oh, it's because you have old eggs. And that may be the case, but it's by no means always the case, because also what happens as women age is that their immune systems become less flexible. And I don't know whether you've ever thought about our immune systems as women particularly, but we have to have ultra flexible immune systems, because we have to have the kind of immune system that can accept an embryo whose DNA is foreign to us and know it's not a pathogen, and yet also ward off germs and disease. And as we get older, our immune system, for reasons that are evolutionary, starts to switch to warding off disease and less of that immunoflexibility. And unfortunately, as women have started to have babies older, our immune system hasn't yet caught up. And a lot of my patients in their late 30s, early 40s actually are suffering from implantation issues because of immune problems. And Chinese medicine is particularly good at modulating that. So I wanted to have this discussion with you, and I wanted to have this discussion with Jeremy. And Emma introduced Jeremy, but let me tell you about Jeremy. Jeremy has been a beloved teacher in New York City for years and years, and he has taught a lot of the Yinova team, not me because I'm ancient, sadly, but he has taught a lot of the Yinova team. And they would say to me, Jeremy says, and Jeremy told me, and Jeremy taught me. And finally, I was like, well, this Jeremy sounds awesome. Why don't we have a Jeremy? And so we got ourselves a Jeremy. In fact, we got ourselves the Jeremy. And he is a clinician at Yinova, but also what's called a clinical mentor. He's there to help people with difficult cases and make sure that every single patient we see gets the state-of-the-art treatment and the best treatment we can possibly give them. So Jeremy, I love chatting to Jeremy incidentally. Immunity, what are your thoughts about immunity?
Well, I'd like to begin by thanking you for that lovely introduction and how happy I am to be working alongside you and working with the Yinova Center and helping to foster everyone's academic and case development. And the place I'd like to begin in our discussion is something, Jill, that you and I have talked about so often in the past. We did a podcast many years ago about nutrition. And I'd like to start with the plant kingdom. Firstly, when we talk about using plants and using herbs to either help our gastrointestinal system, to uplift our mood, to regulate immunity, it's really miraculous what the plant kingdom is capable of doing, something that we aren't capable of doing, which is to capture the energy of the sun, the light of the sun, and convert it into certain compounds, what we will call alkaloids. And these compounds have such a singularly unique structure that they are able to share electron resonance. We call them benzene rings. And these compounds are what allow us to experience consciousness. So many of the substances that we ingest from plants allow us to have our mood. There is no way to feel happiness or emotional flexibility without the ability to create a substance called serotonin from a very commonly known vitamin we know as folate or folic acid. But if we don't get that folic acid from green plants, right, the same root word creates foliage, right, green leafy plants, we don't have the right chemicals, the right catalysts to make all of the neurotransmitters that allow us to experience reality. In fact, our consciousness is dependent on that. And nature has such wisdom in this process. For we as technicians, right, as the human race began to engineer pharmaceuticals and drugs, They look for that one compound that they think is the right active ingredient. We call it the active principle. And they say, aha, we found the aspirin that is going to reduce the fever and it's going to reduce inflammation. And that is the chemical. And so we take that from the white willow tree and we isolate this substance. And yet, in high concentrations, it's corrosive to the inner lining of our stomach, our endothelium. And there is some toxicity in that sense because the white willow tree is engineering that chemical to ward off insects, to protect its delicate vasculature from attack. And nature, in her wisdom, engineers 100 other phytochemicals to insulate the tree from its own corrosive acid, salicylic acid. And this is something that nature has the key to, but we are quite on top of what those combinations are. And so, similarly, in a very limited vantage point, we sometimes find a substance and say, aha, this will build my immune system. I'm going to take it in isolation. And we're only sending things in one axis, in one direction, which is more and more robust. And as you said in your opening statement, sometimes more robust is exactly what we don't want, right? You mentioned that the SARS-CoV-2 pathogen responsible for COVID-19, the body's never seen it before in its existence, and it has this hyperreactivity. And in that instance, we actually want to look for things that are going to modulate or stop that exaggerated response where our cytokines begin attacking our own tissues in our lungs. And before I wrap this, I just want to make a quick citation. There are several studies being conducted, and many in New York hospitals, that have looked at substances like Benadryl, they would call it cetirizine or diphenhydramine, an H1 antagonist, an anti-inflammatory for people with allergic reactions in their lungs and their nasopharynx. And then they looked at another substance called famotidine that the public knows as Pepsid AC, and found that the way in which Pepsid stops the gastrointestinal system from overproducing mast cells that make the cytokines, that make the monocytes, that people that were given these H1 and H2 antagonists, as they're called, did not go into cytokine storm. And so there's a very clear example of where too much is exactly what we don't want. And sometimes that inhibitory pathway is precisely what we need. And so when we make decisions to just overconsume a certain single substance, like a whole mono approach, that may not be what the body needs. It needs to have flexibility. And that's the genius of Chinese medicine, is that your herbalist, your practitioner looks at your unique situation. Where are you at the stage of the illness that you're in, right? In Chinese medicine, they would call pathogens like SARS-CoV-2 a wind heat toxin in some instances, not always. And that's a very changeable, rapidly evolving situation. You need to make decisions within the hour. What is the next step? The next step may not be, let's do the same thing over and over and over again. We look at people as individuals and we look at the body in this complex machinery, right? The balance of yin and yang and of the host and the other. And we make those personalized, individualized prescriptions that are critical.
Well, Thank you for saying all of that. And one of the things I want to pick up on was the reason that herbs can be so helpful when it comes to modulation is that they're already inner-modulating. You made the point that we give people whole herbs, and we're very stubborn about this. We don't like our herbs to be used just for the active ingredient.
Mm-hmm.
And almost always in Chinese medicine, with some exceptions, but very few, we practice what's called polypharmacy. We actually give a whole herbal formula to treat the whole of you at any given time. And we're offsetting side effects like that. And I'm actually extremely proud of how we helped to navigate so many of our patients through COVID, which was a situation that we hadn't seen before. It was a baptism of fire for our clinical mentor, Jeremy, here, who had to lead a group trying to understand the different stages and meeting people, as we said, at different stages, because supporting the immune system in the early stage of a disease, when it's easy to kick it back out, is a completely different thing than supporting it to be extremely flexible in a later stage of disease. And I think this brings me actually to a set of plants, a set of herbs that often get talked about a lot, but I think are often misunderstood, which is adaptogens. Our most famous adaptogen in Chinese medicine is ginseng. Also, astragalus is an adaptogen. Ashwagandha is an adaptogen. But I have found particularly useful during this time mushrooms, all sorts of what I call power mushrooms, reishi mushrooms, mushroom blends. And I wondered, Jeremy, if you would like to talk a little bit about adaptogens and, in fact, mushrooms before we go on to questions from people that people have sent in.
Yeah, thank you, Jill. I really have so much to say about this particular class of fungi that we use medicinally. And another thing that I want to introduce here is so much of what happens in our body with our immune system is based on the gut, is based on our digestive tract. And so many of the chemicals that we make that inform the functionality of our brain are all engineered. 80% of the neurotransmitters that allow us to have a well-regulated mood are engineered in the gut lining by both friendly and perhaps not so friendly bacteria and microorganisms, flora and fauna, that have a certain balance, and that balance is really critical. And so one of the caveats with antibiotics taken excessively or for long duration is that they wipe out those friendly colonies that are so critical to also immunomodulating the body. So one of the ways that people often suggest that we can have a healthful immune system is also to fix the gut biome. But where I'm going with this is the story of mushrooms. Mushrooms, in their propagation across the moist, damp, darkened layers of the earth, form these intense cerebral neural networks underneath the ground that connect to one another. We call them mycelia. And they are a communication mechanism, they are a regulatory mechanism. It's the nervous system of the mushroom. And the most fascinating thing in the world is that most of the medicinal mushrooms have the same type of interfacing in their mycelial network to the same ratio as the amount of connections made in the nerve cells in our brain. It's a map of a nervous system. And according to the law of similars, or what we call the doctrine of signatures, things that visually or geometrically represent something else will benefit that other. So, for example, if you look at a walnut and you look at the interior meat of a walnut, it looks like the diencephalon of a human brain. And we know that those fatty acids in walnuts nourish our brain and our nervous system. And in Chinese medicine, a tangerine, a bitter tangerine, which can look like a breast, will nourish the tissues of the breast. And it goes on and on. Strawberries resemble human hearts, and therefore they're thought to belong to the element of fire. But because mushrooms have that same morphology of our nervous system, they really emphasize the ability to interface the brain and the gut. And they are adaptogenic, and the body understands innately when it receives these substances how to make the adjustments of expanding and increasing certain functions while reducing others. Adaptogens are so beautifully communal to us because they work with our systems to make the proper adjustments. It's not a hard programming. It's the materials we need for the intelligence in our body, as you stated earlier, our chi, to make the decisions that are necessary at that moment. One of the most powerful fungi that we know of, highly anti-carcinogenic and wondrously neuroprotective, but most importantly, really guards the lung system, the pulmonary system, and helps with chronic lung disease, is called Cordyceps. And so many herb companies that manufacture formulas and engineer formulations that they sell will place Cordyceps and another mushroom called Ganoderma or reishi mushroom in their immune enhancing formulas, because they know that rather than over excite the immune system, it will make the deficiencies more resplendent, and it will dampen down the excess. And they're mighty powerful indeed. They've been used for chronic respiratory illnesses for thousands of years.
What I took from that, Jeremy, and I want to make sure that at home we have some take-home practical things to do as well. Actually, what I took from that is what a wonderful teacher you are. Is what I really took from that. I could listen to you explain mushrooms for hours. However, what I took from that is that our gut is hugely important. And in fact, the statistic is that 25% of our immune cells are in our gut, and 50% of our immune response comes from our gut. So the first way to build a flexible immune system is to support your digestive system. And it was Hippocrates who said in about 400 BCE, all diseases begin in the gut. And considering he was operating in times that were pre-scientific and didn't know what the statistic I just gave you, how impressive is that? He did that from observation. And of course, he was right. And I am what's called a spleen and stomach school acupuncturist. I'm an earth school acupuncturist. I believe that regulating people's digestive systems helps them regulate the rest of their body, their mood, their menstrual cycle. And so I often start with the gut. And not all Chinese, there's debates in Chinese medicine, those of you watching, about where to start in addressing a disease process. But that's usually where I start. So one of the take-homes for you is how do you build a healthy microbiome? Well, obviously, the first thing everybody thinks about is probiotics. But in fact, I think the first thing to think about is prebiotics. And that is fiber, not the kind of fiber that you take from a packet, but the kind of fiber that comes from vegetable matter. So an abundance of different vegetables for the healthy bacteria to feast on. Yeasts have a tendency to feast on sugar, but the bacteria we are trying to encourage need fiber, need plant fiber. So legumes, beans, and lots of leafy greens and colorful plants, fruits and vegetables are an important start to a healthy gut. And then I would say that food probiotics are way more powerful than taking pills. Now, I take a probiotic pill, having said that, and I often give them to patients, but I also try to eat a lot of kombucha, miso. I make my own yogurt every other night. I make yogurt every other night. It's the simplest thing in the world to make, incidentally. You can always get hold of me through Yinova, and I will talk you through making your own yogurt. Sauerkraut, kimchi, that kind of thing. Sauerkraut and kimchi are particularly important because they contain the prebiotics along with the probiotics. So I wondered if you had some thoughts, because you're nodding along. I wonder if you have some thoughts about probiotics, Jeremy.
Oh, I was just getting very hungry and excited about you talking about kimchi and sauerkraut and kombucha and all these fermented foods that have that prebiotic material that allows us to do this through the process of really tantalizing our senses. We can all take a pill or a tablet very easily, but I think the more as mammals, as creatures that are, fascinated by things that we see and touch and smell and can taste, it's so much more pleasurable to work with the production of nature in order to nourish and to foster that type of healthy gut. The more it can be a part of the enjoyment and the feast of the senses of eating, I think that that's super important. And while you were talking, Jill, I thought, and the reason I was nodding, I was reminded back in the 1980s, there was a whole series of Japanese immunologists that were writing about HIV. And they said back at that time, I think it was late 70s, early 80s, when this was really getting started, this other terrible, terrible illness was sugar is something that we really need to avoid when dealing with our immune system. Sugar will cause, through its acidification, so much disruption to the digestive tract and allow opportunistic infections to grow and to propagate. And that there are substances also that, in addition to let's add these in, let's bring in things that are wonderful and delicious, to be mindful that there are other items that we often fancy and crave that can work against us. And it's primarily because of its ability to allow, as you mentioned, things like yeast to overcrowd the more beneficial microorganisms that we need to have that gut balance.
So far we have got support your gut, reduce your sugar, up your probiotics, preferably from food, and your prebiotics, and consider mushrooms and adaptogen herbs in general, because they help you modulate, which is what we're really trying to do with our immune systems. We're not trying to boost them through the roof. I want to talk a little bit, though, Jeremy, about circulation. I think part of a healthy immune system is circulation. And we think about circulation in relation to our heart. Obviously, a healthy heart requires blood to be pumping through it. But actually, a healthy body requires blood to be moving. It removes debris. It brings immune cells to where they're needed. And so this is where exercise comes in, and anything that boosts circulation, isn't it? It's an important part of your immune system.
Yeah, in fact, I would say that improving circulation is a foundational strategy in East Asian medicine, right? If there is not oxygenated blood, the ability for it to create metabolic energy and to allow all these processes to occur in every corner of our body, then our metabolic functioning, our ability for energy to be stored and activated and instrumented, isn't happening. And what's really fascinating about that, Jill, as you're speaking, is that the current pandemic, circulatory issues are really critical. One of the things that SARS-CoV-2 does is it inhibits circulation by deoxygenating the blood. So going back to Chinese medicine, breaking blood stasis, moving circulation, moving the qi and blood through the body is one of the most critical strategies in every condition, right? If we don't have oxygenated blood and qi circulating through us, we're not really living with our fullest vibrancy. So I think that that is a really important consideration, is movement, and movement that isn't an overstrain, whether it's yoga or taking daily walks for as long as possible and just getting oxygen into the blood and allowing blood to move. One of the things that's been tricky in the last 10 months is we find ourselves somewhat more encumbered and not feeling as free. So anything that we can do if we're forced into a sedentary situation, what would really be fantastic is to then take on videos of Qigong exercises or gentle movements like Tai Chi that we could do within our home that allows us to increase circulation, but may be adaptive to our more interior environments.
Well, that has been the problem, of course, is that people have been on lockdown for months and not moving around as much. And also, it's all been so anxiety provoking, I think, that sugar becomes a bit of a comfort. I am exactly like my patients. That's why I'm a good person to talk to about your health, because I struggle with that kind of thing myself. So far, everybody, I'm keeping count. We have got improve your circulation, improve your microbiome, take prebiotics and probiotics. I think reduce inflammation, and partly reducing sugar is about reducing inflammation, isn't it? But inflammation is another way that circulation gets impeded at a cellular level, and it stops your body from your immune system from being able to remove debris. It stops immune cells from being able to reach where they're supposed to go. And so I wondered if you had some thoughts about inflammation.
I think that clearing inflammation is something that is more of a root cause of disease, much like when we talked about inhibited circulation. And in the last year or two, I think it's become the central conversation in medicine. And again, I have to bring in a tendency for people to overconsume one particular substance, believing that that's going to solve a particular issue. And I think of turmeric, right? That like, if only I take as much turmeric as I can find, I'm going to completely defeat my inflammation. And turmeric is a Chinese herb, and it has, strong properties of draining heat and clearing inflammation and cleansing the liver, but it also can be taxing if taken in too great of a concentration and only on its own. So I really want to get into that idea of the polypharmacy again, of having a qualified herbalist prescribe these particular plants in concert or in symphony with other plants that can modulate their more excessive effects. I think that the whole key to inflammation is that in treating these illnesses recently, which could be chronic, debilitating, lifestyle-induced illnesses, or the current pandemic, whenever they saw the ability to diminish inflammation in the patient substantively, there was often a miraculous healing event that followed. And I think that that's something that we really need to consider. What are the plants and what are the foods that have anti-inflammatory properties? And I just want to mention something, if I could get specific. The most powerful plant in the Chinese pharmacopoeia for fighting off pathogens, such as influenza or SARS-CoV-2, is called in Chinese Ban Lan Gan. And we probably know it by its common field name, Isatis. And this root, back in the year 2002 and prior, when the first SARS was spreading throughout Asia, the cost of Ban Lan Kren increased 800% because people knew the following about it. It's antibacterial, it's antiviral, it's antifungal, it's an antitoxin. But the thing that pharmacologists are looking at now, that are studying the pharmacokinetics of herbs from a more Western biomedical standpoint, is its anti-inflammatory properties are what are saving people during these events like Cytokine Storm. There's other herbs that we use, like honeysuckle, Yinova in Chinese, that will actually stop SARS-CoV-2 from replicating, from reproducing in the body. And in a very famous Hollywood film, I believe it was called Outbreak, the one with Kate Winslet and who was the other famous actress, Gwyneth Paltrow. And I think everyone became really obsessed with this film. Talked about forsythia. That was just a fictional part of the script, but forsythia is known as lianchao. It's often combined with honeysuckle, and they have these tremendous properties of stopping these diseases. But I just wanted to jump back to Isatis. Its real powerhouse is that it's anti-inflammatory. And so that's something that I think is really going to help people in so many of the ways in which we provide strategies people can achieve that.
And I do think it's important then to, obviously the one thing we do every day that changes our body chemistry is eat. And so a sort of anti-inflammatory food strategy becomes important. So things that are pro-inflammatory, sugar we have talked about, unfortunately, because sugar can be very comforting when you're on lockdown, but sugar, alcohol, coffee, wheat, gluten sometimes for some people, dairy for some people. If you are someone who gets inflamed in reaction to a food, and it can be quite individual, there isn't one size fits all, human beings are extraordinarily unique, then cutting those back. What is helps you defeat inflammation? Lots and lots of leafy green veggies. We're going to go back to leafy green veggies. They're not only just prebiotic, but they're a huge help, and as are all sorts of culinary mushrooms. I'm lucky, I live in the country, so I have access to mushrooms that people pick and sell, and I trust them not to poison me, because of course that's the interesting thing about mushrooms as well, Jeremy. There are poisonous mushrooms too. So moving on, actually, we have a question, and it seems like a good time for Emma to ask it. Someone asked ahead about Echinacea, and because we're talking about turmeric, which is anti-inflammatory, one of the most famous herbs that people take in order to boost their immune system, a herb that's sold for immune boosting, is Echinacea, and we had a question about it. Emma, there you are.
First of all, just to pause really quickly, I've been loving so much hearing you both speak, and I'm learning so much, and thank you for sharing your wisdom with us. This is really awesome. So we had a few questions about Echinacea, but just kind of umbrella it. It'd be great to know how you both feel about the different varieties of Echinacea.
Well, there are lots of varieties of Echinacea, but there are only 3 that are considered medicinal. I have Echinacea in the garden. It's called coneflower, purple coneflower, and it is sort of ubiquitous across the United States and Europe. The 3 that are medicinal are Purpura, Pallida, and Augustifolia. And of those, Purpura has the most clinical research, although Augustifolia is the most indigenous one to America. It was used by Native Americans, where it was called elk flower, because they noticed that elks who were sick went to eat it instinctively and very smartly. So they all work in a very similar way, and they are all anti-inflammatory. In fact, there's clinical research that shows that Echinacea is very good for treating osteoarthritis, for instance. Here's where things sometimes go awry. In order to be anti-inflammatory, Echinacea is very cold. And it works. I think the research is that it shortens the duration of a cold by a couple of days. We have other herbs in Chinese medicine that do the same thing. And because it does that, people start to take it as what's called a prophylactic. They take it ahead of time in the hope that it'll ward off a cold. And I am somewhat dubious about taking something as cold as Echinacea every single day. When you don't need it. I think you should have it in your medicine cabinet for when you do, but you should be responding to your body as it is. And a lot of people already have quite cold digestive systems. If you have loose stools, particularly in the morning, undigested food in your stool, if you have a literally cold abdomen, that when you put your hand on your tummy it feels cold, then adding Echinacea to your day is possibly going to make that worse. And what did we just say is important to a healthy immune system? A really well-functioning gut. So that's my thoughts on Echinacea. What about you, Jeremy?
Well, just dovetailing with what you're saying, I think that one of the generic dangers that we face when we take something prophylactically over long periods of time, which an experienced herbalist will often caution you from doing. Like if you're going to take something as long as 6 months, we advise every 5 days, taking 2 days off, every month, taking 1 week off. You don't want your body to get bored. And what I mean by that is if there's a substance, in addition to doing the cold damage that Jill was speaking to with loose stools and such, you don't want your body to get so disinterested with something that's omnipresent that its effective action also stops working. The reason why a seasoned herbalist will often have you cycle or take time off is so that your brain and your liver and your stomach and everybody involved in the active processing of these medicinals gets a little like, hey, where'd that go? I need more. And if it's always there, it ends up losing its efficacy. And a great example is for someone who's taking an SSRI for depression, is that sometimes you have to increase the dosage of that particular pharmaceutical over time because there's so much serotonin, there's so much feel-good chemistry in your brain that your nerve cells in your brain go, there's a lot of serotonin I'm going to downregulate now because there's too much happening. And then it loses its efficacy. It's the similar principle. And so with Echinacea, I just believe that it's an overuse tendency. The other caveat, and this is really important, is that if we're in this 21st century state where pandemics are unfolding across the planet and there is danger, a lot of these substances that people hyperdose when they're feeling sick, including black elderberry syrup, if you take all of that while a cytokine storm is starting, it's going to have really negative effects. In fact, as herbalists in the East Asian tradition, we have whole strategic changes at that moment. We don't want to keep building your immune system when you're engaged in a battle, because that defense, your immune system, what we call the upright chi, that fight between your defense and the pathogen is going to get too feverish and too extreme, and it's not going to be pleasant, or it's going to have a negative effect. The only thing that I would say everyone should be very deliberate about taking long-term over the course of winter and spring is vitamin D3. Vitamin D3 is in short supply in our bodies, for I believe most of us, are living in the northern hemisphere. And as it is the shortest day of the year, we're not getting a lot of sunlight. And most people, when they get their serum levels of D3 checked, they're very low. And even in New York City, if you live and work in the 5 boroughs or any metropolitan area, the structure of the skyscrapers and the buildings, even in summer, prohibits you from getting adequate daily sunshine. The key with D3 is you want to make sure that it has K2. Vitamin K2 is coupled with it so that it can work and become more bioavailable. Way back in 2009, when H1N1 or swine flu was sweeping across the planet, Ukrainian nurses in Kiev were heroically saving patients from another novel virus by submuscularly injecting them with up to 30,000 IUs of vitamin D3 at a time. We only recommend 2,000 to 5,000 IUs a day orally. But that's something that really is helpful. And the good news is, in addition to bolstering and neuromodulating your immune response, because we don't just want to amplify, vitamin D3 is really good for depression. And so if you have seasonal affective disorder, as we move into January and February, it's a double bonus.
Well, just moving on from there, we have a question in the Q&A from Joanne, who asks, does the same go for vitamin C? What about vitamin C? What do you think?
I think vitamin C is something that also you can take on a regular basis. I would recommend it being liposomal,
Yes.
because liposomal means that it's going to be better tolerated. We have a thing with ascorbic acid where if you take too much in its traditional form, so to speak, it causes bowel intolerance. There is a bowel tolerance level, and it can upset your GI system. but I would think that if you could take it liposomally, typically that's offered in 500 milligram increments, and combine it with a little bit of zinc, that's also something that could be taken on a daily basis. I also want to emphasize something Jillian said earlier. As much as you can make this from the foods that you eat, right? From citrus fruits. And if you don't want a lot of fruit, did you know that sweet red peppers and orange and yellow peppers and green peppers have 4 times the vitamin C of an orange? So also the leafy green vegetables that Jill mentioned are really high in vitamin C, vitamin A, and interestingly, folate. So they lift your mood.
Well, I honestly think we should make cruciferous vegetables into some kind of religion. That's what I say to my patients. Eat leafy greens like they're a religion. People often ask me what I'm taking during these times. I bet they do, you too. And I take a vitamin D3, liposomal vitamin C, and some zinc and a probiotic. And that's more than I would normally take. And I'm taking that because we're in the middle of a pandemic. And every now and again, I cycle through some anti-inflammatories, but I give my body a break from them. And I also do different ones. So I sometimes do quercetin, sometimes I do bromelain, sometimes I do turmeric, but and then I take some time off. So I sort of go through. What do you think, Dr. Pulsifer?
I have to tell you, I do the same thing with my Chinese herbs. I love how you're rotating through quercetin, bromelain, and turmeric. And that's really the way to do it. Is they're powerful, and so you want to get them in your system because they're amazing, but you don't want them to saturate. And so I do that with my Chinese herb formula that was prescribed to me as a defense against getting COVID-19, so that when I was perhaps moving around the city when it was necessary, that I'd have that extra shielding. And I really believe this. I can't take the same Chinese herb prescription, we call it the jade windscreen, every single day. I feel it starting to wear on my system. So I'll take it for a week, and then I'll stop for a week, and then I'll start taking it again, or I'll take it more surgically when I feel like I'm in more of an exposure period. But I think I'm getting more power, Jill, when I'm doing it that way. Again, rather than my body always going, oh, this again? Whatever. I think that you have to make it come to yearn for those substances again. And I think that the big message here, Jill, in our conversation is that everything doesn't have to happen all the time, every single day, or else. I think that these punctuated, strategic ingestion of certain substances is what really gives us that flexibility that you've been discussing, and why you brought this talk together. Is the way in which you get flexibility and immunomodulation is to give your body a workout. Sometimes you do a sprint, sometimes you do a walk, but most certainly you have to take a break.
Yes, you have to mix it up a bit. Otherwise, your body takes it for granted. You mentioned a herbal formula there that I wanted to draw people's attention to, called Jade Windscreen, Yu Ping Feng Son in Chinese. It is a wonderful prophylactic, actually. Again, like Jeremy, I wouldn't take it the whole time, but I do take it in cold and flu season. We historically, I worked in a public hospital. People cough and sneeze on me the whole time. And I take a jade windscreen. We have a beautiful version of it that's made for us in California at Yinova in tincture form, which I like very much. And I always have some on hand, and I rotate that through too. But I think this is an interesting idea for people. Also, to be honest, herbalists take way less herbs than the rest of you do. Isn't this true? Herbalists are very judicious in the herbs they take. And so it's often good to ask a herbalist what they take. But I do have a bottle of jade windscreen in my purse, and I will take it pretty regularly. And I prefer that to sort of echinacea and golden seal as a prophylactic myself. It's more warming, it's less cooling, so it's less destructive to the digestion.
Jill, I wanted to say something that's really exciting. The real benefit of seeing a certified herbalist is they can take something like jade windscreen and they can add an herb or two in there that over the centuries have shown to enhance its function. And one of the techniques that I've seen a lot of our master herbalists introduce is adding herbs that boost circulation. You mentioned this earlier, and adding Chinese salvia or danshen to that and allowing the circulation to also be perfused in the body. And also, sometimes people will add patchouli because we call particular pandemics pathogen, we say it's a damp pathogen. And the aromatic properties of patchouli, or in Chinese, huoxiang, are able to wake up the spleen and get the middle to really protect against not just the pathogen's invasion, but help the gut balance and adjust the digestive system. So many people that get sick with COVID end up with digestive complaints. And so that's another thing, Jill, that I think is key, is that it shows up differently in each person that ends up stricken, and that as herbalists, we adjust the strategy. Maybe we make things a little bit different for this person who has perhaps something wrong with the toes, or someone's having loose stools. The thing about going to Yinova or seeing an herbalist that's certified is they make sure that what they're taking is for them individually.
Well, I don't know whether people know this, but at Unova, we make a separate herbal formula unique to you for every patient. And that means we have a pharmacy in each of our Unova centers, and we're mixing. It's the sort of Harry Potter end of our business in many ways. It's so much fun. But one of the things we're able to do, when I'm writing a herbal formula, say for a patient with an autoimmune disease, which we haven't talked about, but this is sort of an overactive immune, it's the body's intelligence working in a different way, malfunctioning in a different way. I always start with their constitution, and I start with a formula for their constitution. What did they start out with a propensity towards? Because everybody, has deficits and things that are good about their body. We're born with a certain sort of pattern. And so, some people are metabolically challenged. Some people tend to get very inflamed and fidgety. So we start with their constitution, and then I look to boost circulation and support digestion and reduce inflammation. It's exactly the same thing. I'm not attacking a pathogen. I'm actually dealing with a body that thinks it's at war when it isn't and is overacting. Allergies, I do the same thing. And why is this body producing this much mucus against pollen? Well, is it constitutional? Do they have a constitutional tendency to produce mucus? Does that come from the digestive system? Are they inflamed? And that is what we as herbalists do. We look at all of you and think, in the context of this whole human being, including their emotional life and their spiritual life and, the pressures on them. One of the questions I ask patients all the time is, tell me a little about the pressures that are on you and how you manage them. And I learn so much from that question about what someone's life is like when they start to open up about their difficulties. Well, often when I treat an autoimmune disease, when I ask that question, they talk about their life as if they're at war. And I start to realize, well, of course they're giving their body the message. We are on the verge of an enormous battle and we must mobilize everything we've got. And then their body over mobilizes. So I wondered if you had some thoughts on autoimmunity.
I think that when we're referring to autoimmune conditions and the body's inability to identify the self versus the other or the uninvited, I think that many times what we're facing is the environment that we're living in has become so toxic and so caustic to our daily existence. And the stressors that we are exposed to of living in the 21st century, and the political scene and the climate issues that we're involved in, and just the day-to-day functionality of living in a highly technologically inflected society where we're almost syncretizing or becoming symbiont with artificial intelligence. And I'm more comically just saying we live in our phones, we live in our screens, and that's reorganizing our nervous systems because we evolved up in a more organic, outward facing, like bucolic pastoral type of environment. Now we're slowly coming into this more energetic realm, and we're basically linked to it. And some of my colleagues who teach at Pacific have mentioned this to me, that they believe that the meridians that we work with in acupuncture are changing their format to accommodate all this extra electronic information. And so I surmise or postulate that our bombardment with this new realm that we're living in is making the body's identification system, its immune recognition of what is me and what is not me, getting really kerfuffled, if you'll excuse me for using the word, and having a problem with identifying. And so I feel like what we're going to see is autoimmune conditions, over the next century are going to continue to increase. And that is where the subtlety and the majesty of East Asian traditional medicines are really going to come into play, because we're working with the body's innate intelligence, right? If there's one thing in the body that has the ability to know, I am here, this is me, this is not me, this is the integrity of how I live, and I can run millions of chemical reactions and nerve impulses without having to consciously focus on any of them automatically. Grabbing onto that innate intelligence within the body, the chi, and allowing that to be the regulator is what I think is going to be the solution for these challenges that lay ahead.
Well, I have an interesting story about this, actually, Jeremy, about a patient, because, of course, this is a very good use of adaptogen herbs. And I once had a patient, a man who had autoimmune kidney failure. He was on dialysis and he was waiting for a kidney transplant. And he was really very sick. And he came to me for herbal advice. And it's always difficult to know what to give a patient like that. I talked to his doctors, and his doctors were understandably concerned about what herbs were processed through the kidney, what were processed through the liver. And so we settled on something food-like, which turned out to be mushrooms. And we have a very good mushroom formula in the office. And I gave him the mushrooms because they're adaptogenic and because they were the only thing his doctor would agree on, because mushrooms are somewhat food-like, and he felt, or in fact food, and he felt like if it would be okay for the patient to take them. So the patient took the mushroom formula and over time got better and better, much to all of our amazement. And he stopped having to be on dialysis, and his kidney function was restored. And he ended up coming off the list for a kidney transplant. And I never saw him again, because I only see people when they're sick. But I often think about him, and I hope he's well, and I assume the fact that I haven't heard from him means that he is. But that is an example of an autoimmune disorder that was so serious that it was destroying an organ, that was turned around by the subtlety and the intelligence of an adaptogen herb, those beautiful mushrooms that you spoke about.
Jill, the most challenging case that I faced in our center this year, I wanted so deeply in my heart, I'm like, I want this person to recover. I want them to go to their physician, and I want them to hear the words, we are unable to find any traces of what was happening on before. And I must concede to you and everyone here, it was the 5 mushroom formula when I decided this is appropriate. This is indicated based on her pattern and presentation. And sure enough, everything that we would have hoped, Jill, unfolded exactly that way.
Yes, we have a lovely mushroom formula. And those of you who are practitioners who are listening, don't discount the mushrooms. I felt like I'd given them by accident. I would have given something a lot more complicated. Yep. And actually, one of my journeys as a practitioner is that I've got much simpler as I've got older. And we ran the Yinova pharmacy out of our home for a little while this summer when we were all on lockdown. And my family said, you prescribe the simplest formulas of just about anyone at Yinova. And I was like, that has been my journey. I speak to the body in simple language these days. I think a confused body, and many of us have a very confused body for all the reasons that you were talking about, it's like training a puppy. You just keep putting it back on the mat. You just give it simple directions until it gets it, and then you can move on to the next one. Emma, do you have a question for us?
Yes, I have a few. One person just sent an anonymous question, and while we're still talking about mushrooms, I wanted to make sure to ask them. So they said, I have seen mushrooms like Cordyceps or reishi contraindicated for autoimmune patients. Do you have thoughts on this? And thank you.
Jeremy, do you have thoughts on when mushrooms are contraindicated for people with autoimmune diseases?
I think that to say that all mushrooms are contraindicated for a particular set of conditions is too broad of a stroke, but I would give you the logic so that we can think through this together. If the immune system is in a state where it is exaggerated and it is self-immolating or self-punishing at that point, anything that you would give that would exacerbate that particular state of the immune system isn't going to be favored. But the query and the quandary that I find myself in is that these mushrooms, right, such as turkey tail, cordyceps, reishi, and many other, lion's mane, some of them are more neurological, some of them are more immunomodulatory. They're still modulating. They're still not making everything go one direction or another. It does not surprise me that people would say that cordyceps and reishi are contraindicated, much in the way that I would say 50% of the herbs that you could prescribe are contraindicated when somebody's seriously ill because it wouldn't send things in the right direction. But I would just make sure that you spoke to a qualified herbalist who's experienced, because there are exceptions to those rules. And we don't look at those plants, botanicals, minerals the same way a biomedical lens would look at it. It's like, this is for, gastritis, and this is for depression. There's temperatures, there's tastes, there's meridians that they influence, there's organs that they favor, and not every person with a condition has the same diagnosis in Chinese medicine. This happens a lot with phytoestrogenic herbs. People are saying, oh, you can't take this herb because it's phytoestrogenic, and this person has a genetic predisposition to a certain type of breast cancer. But that isn't a definitive declaration. That's controversy that lives between the person studying pharmaceuticals and pharmacokinetics and herbalists that might be 8 generations back in China. So that's a really good concern, but that's something that the professional would find their way through for that individual patient.
And I actually think a lot of it comes from the fact that we associate, or people have associated mushrooms with immuno boosting. And obviously you don't want to boost your immune system if you have an autoimmune disease. And what we're saying is that many of the medicinal ones, the most powerful ones, are immunomodulating. They're very intelligent, and they can be used judiciously, but they need to be used by someone who's keeping an eye on you. I mean, my patients who are seriously sick, I communicate with daily, and I'm adapting what I do to treat them. I also don't treat them without Western medicine, just for people watching. I'm a huge believer in integrative partnerships. I think we all, the patients do better when we all get on the same team.
That's one of the benefits at Yinova is so many of the patients that we work with, we're working in tandem and harmony with their Western medical doctors, and we don't make decisions that are contrary or averse to what the MD wants. We're working as a team. The other thing I'd like to mention, just sort of derivative of that question, is a really good example. As Jill knows, and as both of us have done, we've treated so many people in tandem with their doctors for COVID-19. And one 19-year-old boy in particular, I had successfully helped through a very rough patch. And his whole family was living with him. And of course, they were worried about contracting. And they all called and said, we want all the herbs that he had. And so I want to emphasize sometimes a formula is indicated for a specific person in a specific stage of illness. It doesn't then become a blanket cure for everyone. And so we need to have that discerning eye decide what are the unique properties of that patient and what's appropriate for them. So a lot of those rules that are umbrella-like are put out there to protect people. And so they might be more nuanced in an individual setting.
I think that's a very good answer, actually. Emma, what other questions do you have?
We have a question that someone submitted that says, I have PTSD and deal with psychosomatic issues. What immune advice do you have for someone with those struggles?
Well, first of all, I'm sorry that you're dealing with this, because I know how hard that is. And actually, a lot of what we've talked about tonight, Jeremy, is very relevant for PTSD. And one of the things that I mentioned was that a hypervigilant immune system is often part of a hypervigilance in general. And so we would treat all of you, including your reaction to trauma and your PTSD, as part of helping your immune system to be flexible in this context. What do you think, Jeremy?
I also wanted to emphasize that there is a lot of evidence, and there's also a lot of direct empirical evidence from us working in the clinic that when dealing with PTSD, or for example, another type of mood disorder or trauma, that acupuncture implemented with herbal medicine can be of enormous benefit. And that there are more than just one modality. And that, as Jill stated, the way in which herbs are prescribed that are dealing with the whole person multidimensionally, your feelings, your spirit, your body, the environments that you're living in, and what unique stressors are you facing, that herbal formulas are based on a pattern that involves all of those layers of your being and will benefit the psycho-emotional and psycho-spiritual as much as the physiological. But that also, in addition to acupuncture, which acts on the nervous system in such beautifully resplendent ways, is also going to help in that particular instance.
Emma, I want to get through some questions because Jeremy and I obviously could chat all night.
No, yes, I want to be conscious of people's time, but also we're so lucky to have you both here, so I want to get through as much as we can. A few people had asked about Qigong, which we haven't covered yet today, so I wanted to make sure to ask. And some of the questions were about if you can use Qigong to support your immune system.
Yes, it's a great question, and yes, you can. It speaks to a lot of the issues we've been talking about. I mean, Qigong is a sort of meditational movement that actually, in the movements themselves, modulates between yin and yang. So it gives the body the message to modulate between receptivity and activity at a deep cellular level. It is one of the most beautiful, extraordinary systems of exercise. So yes, it's very, very helpful for your immune system. You can also do specific Qigong to help specific organs. And it's been worked out over thousands of years by people much smarter than us, and is incredible for that. And of course, it boosts circulation. And it's very calming. And I don't mean just because it's peaceful and meditational. It literally calms down overactivity in the body in a way that soothes inflammation and stops overreaction. What do you think, Jeremy? Qigong?
Yeah, I keep hearing your voice in my head as the questions are asked, and then you speak, and then I keep hearing what you would say. And I've heard you say this before, where the mind goes, the chi follows. And so Jill and I and all of our colleagues, we use acupuncture needles, and we give people herb tinctures, and we're creating like a definitive influence where if we insert a needle in the body, it will cause the chi to move in a certain direction and stop pain. Or if we give you this combination of herbs, it will elicit a certain desired result to bring harmony and balance in the body. But your mind can direct the flow of that intelligent, innate energy that flows through you that we call chi, that there are so many names for it across the planet. And Qigong is the focused, meditative use of that intention to create motive force with just the waveforms of your thoughts. And it's a viable form of medicine, and it's something that we can do on our own, and it's something that we can help use with people by distance, right? In telehealth virtual sessions, you can have Qigong instruction and leading, but it's also something that you can study and practice on your own for the amplification of your health and the modulation of your immunity, exactly as Jill said.
And Emma.
Another question that we received, I know that both of you have helped patients through COVID, and someone had asked about your advice on how to keep their immune system strong post having COVID. If there was more specific or advice.
Yes, it's a very, very good question, and one that is certainly very uppermost on our minds because we have a lot of post-COVID patients. The first thing is that we need to meet this where you're at, and people have different reactions to COVID. It's a somewhat idiosyncratic and perplexing disorder, actually. There are clotting issues, there are nervous system issues that we're seeing. People have numbness and tingling, headaches. A lot of our patients are talking about pain that moves around a lot through the nervous system, I believe. So we, first of all, this is a job for a good practitioner of Chinese medicine. This is something you need to talk to us about and tell us where you're at. I start by going back to where you were before you had the disease, and I take a full history of where this went for you, how you went into it, how you came out of it, and where you are now. And then we start by designing a herbal formula that will probably support your digestion. Digestive problems post-COVID are a huge issue. Help restore your microbiome because you will have taken a lot of medicine at this point, and you will have probably a disrupted microbiome. Reduce any residual inflammation, move blood and qi, move circulation. Circulatory problems are a huge problem at this point. And then we would change that formula as you change. As you get better, we then change the formula to support you coming out of this, to restore to full health, hopefully. What do you think, Jeremy?
I would say exactly the same words that Jill has uttered, is that there are many people that deal with what we call long hauler symptoms post-COVID, but Jill's truth is absolutely glorious. It's different in every single person. There's some common themes, right? There's migratory pain. Some people have memory lapses. Some people have ataxia or inability to stand, vertigo, difficulty breathing, shortness of breath with the least bit of exertion. But to say that it always shows up the same would be erroneous. It's every person seems to have their own unique admixture. And I really want to underscore what Jill mentioned, going back to where were they before they acquired this virus, because the virus in its trickery exploits the weaknesses in your body. It's not the same pathway every time, and it figures out where those insufficiencies are and it exploits it, and that's where it does the most damage. So understanding the foundational profile of the patient's health, what is unique to you in terms of how you've moved through the world and how you are comporting yourself and how are you constituted, is critical. So it's an individualistic, personal assessment, and it will be unique to the person. There is no one protocol, only to say that acupuncture and Chinese herbs have been fighting pandemics for over 4,000 years. They grew up in those conditions, and it's amazing what can be done when we blend the work of the traditional East with the modern biomedical 21st century. It really is integration.
Which is really what the vision I had when I founded Yinova was, why don't we all just work together and get people the best of all possible worlds? That's what I want in my life, and I think that's what most patients want. And so we have spent the last 20 years reaching out to doctors and educating doctors and healthcare practitioners about what we do, and educating ourselves about what they do, so that we can integrate care. Emma, I think we have time possibly for just one more, and then a little sum up, and we will release people to have their dinner.
Sounds good. I just want to let everyone know too that we will follow up in the next day or so with a recording of this event, some key points for you to take away. One of the questions that we received was about pediatrics and caregivers and babies, and if you had any advice, if your advice from tonight would differ for a kid.
Yes, our advice does differ. Children are not just mini adults, adults in little bodies. They have a different physiology. We have a pediatric practice at Yinova. I think our pediatric practitioners are here, actually, Dr. Daryl and Dr. Noah, very beloved by little Yinova patients. But kids have a tendency to catch things, as you know, although not this thing. They don't catch COVID in the same way as much, but they do have a tendency. When I think of children, and again, there is no one size fits all, and children have different constitutions, but for the most part, they have underdeveloped digestions. They have weak digestion, so they can often respond negatively to new foods, that kind of thing. They have a tendency to produce mucus, as you know, drippy little noses and repeated ear infections and things like that. And they have a tendency to overheat. And if you've ever seen a child with a fever, their fever goes up like you wouldn't believe, and then comes straight back down. The other thing about kids is that everything changes really, really quickly with them, which is why our pediatric practitioners stay in very close touch with kids with any kind of infectious process, as I'm sure their pediatricians do as well. So when it comes to kids, I think the most important thing in boosting immunoflexibility is one of the things we advise for adults, but this is the most important thing, their digestion. It's about food. It's about giving them food that they digest easily, introducing them to a broad range of foods, and making sure that they have probiotic foods, and developing a healthy microbiome young, and a healthy digestive system. And that seems to resolve a lot of the mucus problems that we see in little ones. So obviously, the more mucousy they are, the less circulation in those organs like their lungs and their sinuses, and the more likely they are to become inflamed and get infections. What say you, Jeremy?
As you're speaking, I think about the persons that focus on pediatrics, where I'm a professor, and every single one of them in clinic, whether it was my friends Melanie or Sylvia, always said the same thing to me, regardless of what the condition was that the child was facing. What is the diet? What are they eating? What's happening at every level of food and liquid that is entering their body? And until we figure that out, we're not going to move forward with our strategy, because that's where we begin. So again, just seeking to reinforce what Jill has stated, and also just continually emphasizing how quickly things can change, and how heat and inflammation and feverishness, right? We call it accumulation disorders, are so quick to hit children. The few of them that have gotten sick from the multi-inflammatory syndrome, the MIST-C condition, is one of tremendous heat and inflammation striking organs. So I want to encourage that acupuncture and herbs and all the modalities that we use, we don't use them the same way as Gillian said in adults. We actually use them in much smaller proportionalities and almost elicit much grander results for children are these tremendous seeds of yang, expanding and growing at a lightning pace. They don't need a lot of push from our interventions to affect really tremendous results. So there is a marked difference. And I want to also endorse Dr. Carol and Dr. Noah that we have persons who are expert at treating children with all these modalities.
Well, thank you. I honestly, Jeremy, you're such a joy to me. Jeremy and I have often joked that we should just have a YouTube channel called Tea with Jill and Jeremy and just tackle stuff. We will tackle that. So I think it's time to sum up. Thank you so much for joining us. We will do this again. There are many things that Jeremy and I would like to tackle at this stage in our careers. We have thoughts after treating all these thousands of patients, and we'd like to share them with you. I think the take home from this is it's a good idea in these pandemic times to take vitamin C, liposomal vitamin C, vitamin D3, and zinc, a probiotic, and eat prebiotic foods. You should look after your gut, and that includes not feeding it lots of sugar and making it acidic, and watch out for things that make you inflamed. Get some exercise, because circulation is one of the best ways of helping your body with its internal communication, the kind of internal communication that it needs in order to have a well-functioning, flexible immune system. And I personally think we should stop talking about boosting immunity and talk about immunoflexibility, which is why I asked Jeremy to join me tonight. Jeremy, what would you like to say? What are your parting thought?
My parting thoughts are to have a deep, intuitive voice within, to listen to your body in those quiet moments, in those moments of what we call yin, and really make a decision at every moment that you pause throughout the day. What is the next right action? What choice am I about to make that's going to inform my health and my continued enjoyment and enrichment of life? And what am I doing just for an immediate gratification? Because believe you me, we all need the pleasures and the escapism, right, of substances, even like sugar, to assuage our disease and our feelings of uncomfortableness that come about in this current era. But to really slow down and think about, how can I change my diet to include some of the foods that we mentioned that are vitamin rich, that are anti-inflammatory, to continue to take the substances that Jill and I have mentioned, and most importantly, to not overdo anything. Everything in moderation, even the very things you think are going to save you. Go easy, cycle, introduce them and then take a pause and do it rhythmically and listen. I'm starting to feel like there's no benefit. I'm starting to feel like something deleterious is happening. Have that quiet inner voice. Take a moment to meditate and make sure you're not overdoing everything, but doing everything in its proper season, in a regulated balance.
And if you would like help with your immune system, we would like to help you. Both Jeremy and I are available online for virtual consults, as are the entire Yinova team. And Jeremy is in the clinic. I am doing energy medicine virtually as well, which is a topic for another day. But Jeremy is back in the clinic along with the Yinova team doing acupuncture. And I cannot stress enough how modulating acupuncture is. It is a way of talking to the body in order to help it self-regulate. When we talked about qi at the beginning of this session, and we talked about it being the body's intelligence, acupuncture is a way of communicating and prompting that intelligence. Jeremy and I may do a whole session just on that, because we have thoughts on that.
Absolutely.
And the way that acupuncture works. However, that is for another night. So thank you, Jeremy Pulcifer. I adore you, and I love listening to you. You are the best teacher, and we are so lucky to have you as a clinical mentor at Yinova. So lucky. Thank you, Emma, for organising this and asking the questions and introducing us so beautifully and being so patient with us and answering all our technical problems through the day. You have no idea how much Emma has to support us technically in order to do this. And finally, thank you, Yinova community, for gathering this evening. We know you have plenty to do, so we appreciate you spending this time with us. And I am going to go off to think deeply about what I want to eat.
Thank you both so much.
Thank you, everyone.
Good night, you guys.
Pleasure. Thank you, Jill and Emma.
Mwah.